This is the Anxiety Recovery Mindset Podcast.
It's utter acceptance, letting it come, even going out prepared to take what will come. Let one's body do what it wants to do. Don't check it. Don't try not to panic. Don't think of something else. Into it willingly. Just as in Australia, when the big waves come, we don't stand up against them. We get dumped if we do. We go under them willingly.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Anxiety Recovery Mindset Podcast. That was Dr. Claire Weeks with some sage advice on anxiety recovery and a nod to the surfers out there. If you've read the book or listened to episode 1, you know how important Claire Weeks is to the work that we've done here and the concepts that we're trying to convey. I don't know if she was the first person to teach these kind of philosophies, but for my money, she was definitely the most impactful and the first one to really package this for public consumption in a way that was simple to follow, believable. She taught with a certain kind of confidence behind what she spoke of that really hits home with somebody when they're in a vulnerable state. And when you're going through a disorder level bout of anxiety or panic, the last thing you need is uncertainty. And I remember the first time I heard her voice on recording, she has this great Australian accent, of course. And even though my grandmother didn't sound like that, you get a grandmother vibe from her, this sort of lived experience that you can hear in her voice. And that confidence comes across as very reassuring, which is valuable to somebody in a high anxiety state, particularly somebody who doesn't know what to do. So we're going to talk a lot about her and her philosophies going forward because they're woven into everything that we do here. And I've said before, I mentioned in the book that I think they are woven into nearly every anxiety recovery program out there. So in some ways, I feel like every anxiety program that works is going to be a repackaged version of the kind of things that she taught 60 or so years ago. The things I write about in my book are no different. They're modified and they're viewed through the lens of time and experience and other people's experience, but they do draw back to the same concepts that she taught a long time ago, the kind of things that you heard in the prior quote we just heard. So I thought it might be useful to bring her into focus for this second episode as a way to continue to help lay the groundwork for what you might be hearing in future podcasts. And I know that if you tuned in for help trying to manage your anxiety, you may not have thought you were signing on for a history lesson, so I won't go too deep into this, but I thought if nothing else, I could just read off of her Wikipedia page a little bit for those of you who might not be familiar. So Claire Weeks was born in 1903 and passed away in 1990. She was an Australian general practitioner and health writer. She had also had an early career as a research scientist working in the field of comparative reproduction. Weeks is considered by many as the pioneer of modern anxiety treatment. I certainly believe she was. Weeks found that many of her patients suffered from various anxiety disorders, and it gives a list here: panic, generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and a number of others. This is interesting. Weeks avoided the term anxiety state as she felt it was too medical. Very interesting and something that we've written about and we will come back to again and again. So she replaced it with nervous illness instead. Weeks was concerned with the severe long-term effects of anxiety and panic disorders and the effect they had on the lives of her patients. And listen to this one, as well as the high failure rate of typical psychiatric treatments. Very interesting, especially psychoanalysis, which many sufferers had tried. Instead, Weeks developed her own unique treatment program. She noted that the patients did not suffer from anxiety problems because they had flawed personalities or traumatic childhoods. Another big one, another big clue right there. Rather, the problems were caused by patients having a habit of fear avoidance, bingo, made worse or caused by a responsive, sensitized nervous system. There's so much to unpack in this paragraph alone. She was critical of both Freudian approaches and attempts by behaviorists to desensitize their patients by using relaxation and breathing techniques. This is so ahead of the curve for what was going on at this time. I would have to look here and see exactly the year she was practicing, but I believe it was early 60s. Yes, her book came out in 62. So we have to understand in 1962, not only was it somewhat of a rarity for a woman to be pushed into the center of a medical issue like this in the public eye, but to take on a lot of these sacred cows like Freudian analysis, psychoanalysis, and the psychiatric approach, it was just about unheard of back then. Even now, we're still having these arguments today. And here's someone who did the work and figured out back then what, in my opinion, those who really understand anxiety recovery now know. We've had a long time to study her work. We've had a long time to look at data. We've had a long time to look at the effects of medication, positive and negative. And we've come to conclusions, having decades to study, that she figured out in a short time. And the way her work stands up today is fascinating. I honestly haven't read through her history in quite a while, and to see this again, understanding how the modern recovery programs are structured, it's just mind-blowing. And I will continue to focus on her work here, as these concepts were definitely instrumental in helping me develop the steps that I suggest for people to overcome anxiety and panic disorder. Possibly modernized a bit, but really broken down in a way that I hope people can relate to, particularly people who may have been at this for a while and have somewhat of an idea of what they're doing, but are having a hard time making the concepts land. One of the things I tried to do in the book was to take these concepts that may sound simple and help them find a way to sink in. Because over the years, I discovered it really comes down to how this information is packaged for most of us. And unfortunately, that's not going to be exactly the same for any two people. But there are some commonalities that I do believe are fairly universal. And really, it's just about coming at this from enough angles that one of these resonates with a reader. My hope is that someone will hear or read something and think, yes, that's it. The light bulb goes on, and suddenly this starts to make sense. So returning to her bio, she did a series of talks with a British TV show in the 80s called Peace from Nervous Suffering. And this was also turned into a book. She has another book called Hope and Help for Your Nerves, which is what I would recommend people start with if they haven't read any of her work. Her audio is also available on iTunes, and you really can't go wrong, honestly. So it describes here how she became interested in this topic, and it says here, Weeks described her own battle with nervous illness in her final book, in which she explained how she began suffering from anxiety. At the age of 26, she was misdiagnosed with tuberculosis, which caused her to become anxious and introverted. Understandable? Weeks' anxiety lasted for 2 years and gave her valuable insight into nervous illness. So this is how it became personal for her, and her course through it is, again, just fascinating because there were so many ways she could have gone at the time. And I'm guessing she tried a lot of those avenues and they didn't work for her, which is a familiar story for a lot of us. The difference is she turned it into a career and essentially a legacy of helping people overcome this condition. Hey, this is Bryan with a quick reminder that if you're enjoying the show and you'd like a bit more, you can check out the book. It's available on Amazon.com. You can also visit the website at www.theanxietyrecoverymindset.com. You can jump on the email list and receive exclusive articles, early access to blogs, and other free goodies. So it says here, Weeks described in her book the 3 main pitfalls that lead to nervous illness. They are sensitization, bewilderment, and fear. She explained that so much nervous illness is no more than severe sensitization kept alive by bewilderment and fear. What she means by that is the long-term impact of stress on the body. Sensitization has sort of become a medical term in recent years, but she really meant it to say, if you've been anxious, if you've been under stress, if your body, your mind, your nervous system have been facing this form of taxation where you are a worrier combined with a lifestyle, potentially combined with how you were raised or genetics, or yes, even life experiences, these things set into the nervous system, not in a way that is necessarily medical, but in the way that if you don't sleep for a couple of days, you get tired. It's not something permanent, but it's something that does happen, right? And sensitization was a term that she coined, as far as I know, to describe this process. And when we are in a highly sensitized state, we become hyper-reactive to basic things. So Small stressors hit us harder. Impacts from things feel more severe, and symptoms can indeed become very severe and very difficult to understand and difficult to bear. So that state was one she focused on because it's not something you can flip off automatically. And the bewilderment part really comes down to our inability to understand this when it first comes on. I have this as one of my steps, and I believe it's step 2 in my book. I should probably know this, but it is about really understanding the mechanisms. The first step 1 in my process is understanding what's happening to you. So not believing that you have a medical condition or some sort of foreign entity doing this to you. But the second step is really understanding the mechanics and having a basic idea. You don't have to be a research scientist, but you do have to have an idea of how the body works. And sensitization is one of her core principles that she used to help people understand what had happened to their body, their mind, their nervous system, and was creating these unbelievable symptoms. So it says, Weeks analyzed fear as 2 separate fears, the first and the second fear. This is another one of these concepts that everybody in the world has borrowed. A lot of people may not know it or they may not admit it, but this comes back to her work. She explained that first fear is the fear that comes reflexively, almost automatically. The patient usually immediately recoils from it, and as they do, add a second fear to the original fear. Examples of second fear are, oh my goodness, here it is again, I can't stand it. It's the second fear that keeps the first fear alive, keeping the sufferer sensitized and keeping them nervously ill. These are her words. This was, again, 60 years ago, and incredible how relevant they are now. So to wrap up our overview on Dr. Weeks, I thought it might be fun to read one of my favorite quotes. It says here, Robert L. DuPont describes in his book, The Anxiety Cure in 1998, that in 1983, he asked Weeks if she had ever had panic disorder. She replied, yes, I've had what you call panic attacks. In fact, I still have them. Sometimes they wake me up at night. DuPont responded by saying he was sorry to hear that. He described Claire Weeks looking back at him in shock as she responded, save your sympathy for someone else. I don't need it or want it. What you call a panic attack is merely a few normal chemicals that are temporarily out of place in my brain. It is of no significance whatsoever to me. So it's easy to see why this is one of my favorite quotes. You have this woman who was willing to stand up against an entire industry, stood up against her peers, was brave enough to speak out and change the way we look at this condition, but also brave enough to stand up to the condition itself at a time when information was not freely available. She wasn't just speaking from scientific literature. She wasn't speculating. She had been through this. She stared it down, and she led the way into a new era of viewing this kind of phenomenon happening in the body as being normal, a completely healthy response, a disordered response for sure, but a healthy response. As we mentioned earlier, if you didn't eat, you would become hungry. If you didn't sleep, you would become tired. And if you have long-term stress and taxation on the nervous system, you can get symptoms, and those symptoms can be scary. They can be overwhelming. And she was the first to come out and recognize this as something that is manageable, can happen to normal people, is not indicative of some sort of mental illness, did not require being traumatized or having any kind of particular childhood adversity, but rather a normal, uncomfortable, natural occurrence that can happen to any one of us. So you can see the relevance she has to the topic and what we're doing here, the book, and really the movement in general of trying to steer people towards understanding these techniques that are so successful and have existed for quite a long time, despite not being talked about in all corners. It's funny listening to some of her old audio here. I can find myself getting a bit choked up as I remember just how impactful this work was for me. And I'm sure it's been that way for countless other people. If you ever want to be inspired, you can go and read the reviews of her book on Amazon. Pick any book, and you don't have to take it from me. I wrote a book. I'm selling a book, and I hope you'll check it out. But there's no book I would ever recommend before hers when it comes to understanding what's going on with this topic. So I hope you enjoyed this little trip down memory lane with Claire Weeks and learned a few things. We'll try to do this with some of the other impactful authors out there, old and new. If you have any suggestions along those lines, please feel free to share them. You can get in touch with me by email. Visit the site at www.theanxietyrecoverymindset.com, and we have a contact form there. You can fill it out and drop me a line, make a suggestion for the show, a topic, a question, check in anytime you'd like. Once again, the book is also on Amazon, The Anxiety Recovery Mindset. I hope you'll check it out if you haven't already. Next episode, I thought it might be fun to answer some questions, so feel free again to send those in. We'll answer those in real time, live on the podcast, and see how that goes. Thanks again for listening, and until then, take care.
And now a last word. Doesn't matter how big a coward you may think yourself at this moment, or how long you may have been ill. If you follow the advice I've given, however haltingly to begin with, if you never let yourself completely despair, and are always willing to try once more, to practice once more, you will recover. I assure you of this.